Jonathan Steele was the kind of man who never looked back. Billionaire, real estate mogul, face of glossy magazines, he was everything the world called untouchable. But fate had a way of waiting in quiet corners. That evening, after a delayed flight rerouted him through a crowded terminal in New York, Jonathan's steps faltered. There, on the cold airport floor near Gate 22, wrapped in nothing more than a worn-out coat, was a face he thought he would never see again. Maya Johnson, his former maid. His quiet shadow of years past, the one who had once made his penthouse feel like a home. She wasn't alone. 2 children lay curled against her sides, their tiny shoes tucked close to her body for warmth. For a moment, Jonathan thought he was hallucinating. The polished floors of the terminal gleamed under fluorescent light. Travelers bustled with rolling bags, announcements echoed overhead, and yet nothing moved inside him except shock. He whispered her name before he could stop himself. Maya. Maya. Stirred at the sound. Her eyes opened slowly, and when she saw him, the disbelief on her face was sharp and unguarded. She pulled the children closer, as if shielding them from a world that had already taken too much. She didn't speak at first. Her silence was not weakness. It was power, the last piece of dignity she had left. Jonathan, who had commanded boardrooms with ease, suddenly found his throat tight. "I thought I'd lost you forever," he said softly. Maya sat up carefully, one arm draped around the children. Her lips were cracked, her eyes rimmed red from sleepless nights. She did not look like the woman who used to polish marble counters and hum lullabies in his kitchen. She looked like a mother fighting the impossible. And yet, even here, on a cold airport floor, there was strength in the way she sat upright, refusing pity. "Why are you here?" he asked, stepping closer, his voice breaking. Maya's laugh was bitter low. "Because this is all that's left, Jonathan, this floor, this blanket, these children." She turned her face away. "You didn't want to know the truth back then, and now you found it, too late." Jonathan's memories came rushing back the night she was accused of stealing a bracelet. The whispers from his fiancée Claire, the board's disapproving glances. He had said nothing. He hadn't defended her. He had let her walk away. And in doing so, he had lost more than he understood at the time. He wanted to explain, to beg forgiveness, but then his gaze fell on the children. 2 small bodies breathing. Softly against Maya's side, "They're not—" He began, Maya's eyes locked with his, firm, unshaken. "They're mine," she said. Her voice trembled only slightly before she added, "And yours." The words hit him harder than any headline ever had. Jonathan staggered back, the truth cutting through years of silence, his own children. Children he had never known, never named, never held. He dropped to his knees without realizing it. "Why didn't you tell me?" Maya's answer was calm, devastating. "Because you didn't look me in the eye when it mattered. Because you let her frame me. Because you let them throw me out with nothing." The terminal buzzed around them, strangers glancing curiously but moving on. In that corner of indifference, time froze. Jonathan saw not the maid he once ignored, but the mother who had carried his children through storms he had never felt. His chest ached with something heavier than guilt. He whispered, "I want to fix this." Maya shook her head. "You can't. Fix lost years. You can't give back the nights I went hungry so they could eat. You can't erase the looks people gave me when I begged for work. You can't fix it, Jonathan." His voice cracked. "But I can try." She didn't answer. Instead, she adjusted the blanket over the children and leaned back against the wall. The silence between them was not empty. It was full, a wall of everything unsaid. Jonathan stood slowly, pulled out his phone, and made a call in a voice sharp and commanding. Minutes later, a black SUV pulled up outside the departure doors. He looked at her, eyes stripped of pride. "Come with me." "You." "And the kids. Somewhere safe." Mayo hesitated, her hand tightening around her daughter's shoulder. "Why now?" she asked. Jonathan's reply was simple, raw. "Because I loved you and I still do. And because I failed you once and I refuse to fail them again." Maya's breath trembled, but her eyes stayed steady. She rose, gathering the children in her arms. Her legs wobbled from exhaustion, but she stood tall. Drive, she said. And with that, the journey began, not of charity, not of rescue, but of redemption, slow and uncertain, lit by the fragile hope that even broken stories can be rewritten. The SUV's quiet hum was the only sound in the tense silence that filled the cabin. Maya sat in the back seat, her body stiff, arms wrapped protectively around Naomi and Elijah, who now slept soundly against her. The children's breaths rose and fell in the safety of their mother's embrace, unaware of the storm of emotions swirling in the car. Across from them, Jonathan sat rigid, his hands clasped together so tightly his knuckles whitened. His polished composure, the armor he wore in boardrooms and public appearances, had been stripped away at the airport floor the moment Maya had looked into his eyes. He had faced financial crises, lawsuits, even the collapse of skyscrapers under construction. But he had never felt this kind of weight, the weight of betrayal, guilt, and longing all colliding at once. He stole glances at Maya, but her face was turned toward the window, her reflection cold and distant. She had once been the warmth in his home, the quiet presence who reminded him he was human in a world of greed and deals. Now she was a wall he could not climb, a silence he could not break. Yet even now, she carried their children as though she had carried the whole world without his help. When the SUV pulled into the driveway of the Langston Residences, a discreet luxury hotel he owned but rarely used, Maya's eyes narrowed. The grand marble facade gleamed under the soft lights, but to her it was just another polished cage. Jonathan stepped out first, gesturing for the driver to help with their belongings, though she had none besides the threadbare bag at her feet. She picked it up herself and followed him inside. The children stirred but didn't wake, their exhaustion too deep. At the reception desk, Jonathan spoke swiftly, his tone low and commanding, ensuring privacy, ensuring no headlines. The staff moved with efficiency, their eyes lowered, their professionalism shielding them from questions. In minutes, Maya and the children were guided into a suite on the 12th floor. The suite was elegant plush cream carpets, velvet couches, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline, but Maya didn't step inside with awe. She paused at the threshold, her children in her arms, her jaw set with distrust. Jonathan noticed. "It's just for tonight," he said softly. "Somewhere warm, somewhere safe." She hesitated, then entered, laying the children on the wide bed. They curled instinctively into each other, their little shoes still on, their tiny hands clutching at the blanket. She stood there watching them, her hand trembling over their foreheads, ensuring they were real, alive, unharmed. Jonathan stood at the doorway, not daring to move closer. When the door finally shut behind them, silence swallowed the room. Maya turned to face him, her voice low, sharp, deliberate. "Don't mistake this for forgiveness." He nodded, swallowing. "Hard, I don't." She crossed her arms, her thin coat slipping from her shoulders, revealing the wear of months of hardship etched into her skin-hollow cheeks, calloused hands, eyes that had learned too much. "You think a hotel room erases the years?" she asked bitterly. Jonathan shook his head, stepping closer but keeping his voice even. "No, it doesn't. Nothing can erase them. But maybe it can start to heal what's left." Her laugh was short, humorless. "You still speak like a businessman. As if healing were a transaction, something you can sign into being." Her eyes burned into his. "You let me walk out of your house with nothing, Jonathan. Nothing but the children in my belly and shame I didn't deserve." He winced, his chest tightening at her words. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, but he had no defense. She was right. Jonathan moved toward the desk, pulled out a folder from the leather briefcase he had carried, and placed it on the table. "This," he said quietly, "is for them, a trust fund. Education, healthcare, a future. No conditions, no strings." Maya didn't even look at it. She stood rooted, her arms wrapped around herself. "Do you think money fills the nights when a child cries from hunger? Do you think money replaces the years of being invisible, of hearing doors close because of the color of my skin, because of whispers you allowed to spread?" Her voice cracked, but her stance didn't waver. Jonathan bowed his head, his heart pounding. "No, I know it doesn't, but it's a start. I don't want to buy forgiveness. I want to take responsibility. She shook her head slowly. You don't get to say that until you've carried the weight. And you haven't, not once. The children shifted on the bed, Elijah murmuring in his sleep. Maya rushed to them, kneeling beside the bed, stroking their hair until they stilled again. Jonathan watched, his heart breaking at the sight. He had missed it all, their first words, their first steps, their nights of fever and fear. He had missed the very essence of being a father. He sank onto the chair by the window, staring at the city lights, his reflection fractured in the glass. For the first time in decades, he felt powerless. And in that powerlessness, he realized something he had always ignored. Power meant nothing when you couldn't protect the ones who mattered most. Hours passed in silence. Maya refused to rest, her body wired from years of never being safe enough to sleep deeply. Jonathan stayed awake too, his thoughts spinning, his regrets suffocating him. Just before dawn, he rose quietly, went downstairs to the cafe, and returned with oatmeal and coffee. He placed them on the table, careful not to disturb the children. Maya, sitting upright on the bed, glanced at the food and then at him. He didn't ask permission to sit. He didn't assume she'd accept it. He just said softly, for when they wake. They shouldn't go hungry, not even for a minute. She stared at him for a long moment, her lips parting as if to argue, but she said nothing. Instead, she turned back to her children, brushing Naomi's curls from her eyes. When morning light spilled through the curtains, the twins woke. Naomi blinked at the tall windows and gasped. "Mommy, we're not outside anymore." Elijah rubbed his eyes, confused, then nestled back into Maya's side. Jonathan stood at the edge of the room, his breath caught at the sound of Naomi's little voice. He wanted to kneel, to say something, but he didn't know how to begin. The children didn't know him. They didn't know his name, his face, his history with their mother. He was a stranger. And yet, when Naomi's curious eyes flicked toward him, there was something, an echo, a resemblance that even she couldn't explain. She tilted her head. "Mommy, who is he?" The question cut the air. Maya's heart clenched. She had shielded them from the truth for so long, waiting for the day she felt strong enough to tell them. Now that day had arrived in a hotel room filled with silence and unspoken pain. She took a deep breath. She hesitated, then looked Jonathan in the eye, daring him to falter. "He's your father." The words hung like thunder in the air. Elijah sat up, his small face scrunched in confusion. Naomi blinked rapidly, staring between her mother and Jonathan. "Our daddy?" she whispered. Jonathan felt his throat close, his heart shattering and swelling all at once. He knelt instinctively, his eyes level with theirs. "Yes," he said softly, his voice trembling. "I'm your father." Naomi studied him for a long moment, her small brow furrowed as though weighing his truth. Then she asked, "Where were you all this time?" The question pierced deeper than any accusation. Jonathan's eyes filled with tears. "I wasn't where I should have been," he admitted. "And I will regret that for the rest of my life. But if you let me, I want to be here now." Elijah crossed his arms, his small voice quiet but sharp. "You made Mommy cry." The boy's innocence carried a truth Jonathan could not deny. He bowed his head, tears slipping down his cheeks. "I did, and I can't take that back. But I want to make sure I never make her cry again." Naomi glanced at her mother, searching her face for guidance. Maya's eyes softened briefly at her daughter, but her voice remained steady. "You don't owe him your trust," she told them. "You don't owe him anything. But if you choose to know him, do it for yourselves, not for me." The twins looked at each other, then back at Jonathan. Naomi reached out first, her small hand brushing against his. Elijah hesitated, then leaned into his sister, half curious, half guarded. Jonathan froze at the contact, his heart aching with a love so fierce he could hardly breathe. For the first time, Jonathan Steele, the billionaire who once commanded towers and fortunes, felt what it truly meant to be rich. Not in wealth, not in assets, but in the fragile, precious trust of two children who carried his eyes, his blood, his hope. He vowed silently that he would never let them down again, even if Maya never forgave him. Redemption was not a gift he could claim. It was a road he would have to walk, step by step, proving himself not with power or money, but with presence. And as the morning sun rose over the city, bathing the skyline in light, Jonathan realized the truth he had buried for too long. The empire he had built meant nothing if the foundation of his own family was broken. This was not the beginning of a charity. This was the beginning of a fight for love, for dignity, for forgiveness. A fight he could not afford to lose. Jonathan sat by the window of the plane as the city lights below faded into a blur of gold and gray. His reflection on the glass didn't look like the man who once stood at the peak of the financial world. The sharpness in his features was still there, but softened by something unfamiliar, regret. He leaned back, closing his eyes, but sleep refused to come. Every time his lids grew heavy, memories dragged him backward. The day he first saw Maya, carrying cleaning supplies in his mansion, the night he dismissed her cries when her paycheck was delayed. The cold look in his own eyes when she begged him not to cut her hours. Those were moments that had meant nothing to him then, just fleeting inconveniences. But now, each one struck him like a blade carving into his chest. He realized the greatest wealth he had once possessed wasn't the empire he built, but the loyalty, the small silent kindness, the quiet presence of people like Maya whom he had overlooked. He had lost more than money. He had lost the humanity that made wealth meaningful. Maya, in contrast, sat in a corner seat 2 rows behind him, wrapped in a second-hand coat that barely kept the chill away. She had dozed off, her head resting lightly against the side of the window, but the exhaustion in her sleep was plain. Every few minutes, her body twitched, as though even rest couldn't escape the grip of fear and hunger. The 2 children leaned against her shoulders, their faces fragile in the dim glow. Jonathan turned once to glance at them, and for the first time in years, something like shame made his throat tighten. He wanted to speak, to reach out, to say her name, but the gulf of years, of decisions, of wounds he had inflicted, felt like an unbridgeable chasm, so he stayed silent. The silence between them was heavier than the engines of the plane. When the plane landed, the cold air of the early dawn swept into the terminal. Maya held her children's hands and walked slowly toward the exit, carrying only a worn duffel bag. Jonathan, carrying nothing but his leather briefcase, watched her from a distance. He noticed how she hid her face when the cold wind stung her cheeks, how she pulled the children closer as though shielding them from the world. Something inside him cracked, but still he said nothing. His pride, though dented, still kept him chained. He stepped into his waiting car while she walked out into the harsh street, looking for a bus that could take her anywhere away from the city that had broken her spirit. That night, Jonathan couldn't sleep in his penthouse. The silence of his home, once comforting, now suffocated him. Every corner whispered with echoes of the past rooms once polished by Maya's hands, the kitchen where she prepared tea for him when he had late meetings, the hallway where she carried stacks of linens without complaint. For the first time, he wondered how much of his success had been built on the silent sacrifices of those he never saw. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, but it burned in his throat like guilt. He set it down untouched. For the first time in his life, he admitted the truth. He had wronged Maya, and he could no longer run from it. The next morning, Jonathan made a decision. He called his assistant and demanded every piece of information they could find on Maya Williams, where she lived, where she worked, what had become of her after she left his service. Hours later, the report came. She had been evicted 3 times in the past decade. She had worked in diners, laundromats, and cleaning agencies, barely keeping her children fed. Her medical bills had gone unpaid. Her children's schooling was inconsistent. The weight of those words hit Jonathan harder than any market crash ever had. He closed the file, unable to read further, and whispered to the empty room, "What have I done?" But fate was already weaving its threads. Later that same week, while Jonathan visited a hospital for a charity event, one of the few public appearances he still agreed to attend, he froze at the sight across the hallway. Maya sat there in the waiting room, her coat wrapped tight, holding her son's hand as a doctor explained the cost of a treatment she couldn't afford. Jonathan's breath caught in his chest. He wanted to walk forward, to speak her name, to offer the help she so clearly needed. Yet he hesitated, paralyzed by the fear that she would turn away. that his apology would mean nothing against the years of pain she endured. But as he stood frozen, the little girl beside Maya looked up, and her innocent eyes met his. They were wide, searching, and in them Jonathan felt something break entirely, because those eyes, though tired, carried the same silent strength he had once seen in Maya. He realized then that the story wasn't over. It had only just begun. The next morning rose heavy with the weight of choices that neither Maya nor Jonathan had fully reckoned with the night before. The airport encounter had begun as nothing more than an awkward collision of two worlds, hers, marked by quiet sacrifice, and invisible struggles, and his, shaped by a life of relentless success and privileges that insulated him from ordinary hardship. But now, as sunlight spread across the city skyline, both carried with them the residue of that moment, a strange mixture of regret, curiosity, and unresolved tension that bound them in ways they hadn't anticipated. Jonathan, seated in his penthouse office with its floor-to-ceiling glass walls, stared down at the metropolis, his morning briefings untouched on the table. His assistant droned on about board meetings and acquisition targets, yet none of it seemed to land. Instead, his mind kept drifting back to Maya's exhausted face, her trembling hands clutching her child's bag, the shame she carried like a second skin. He had seen her years ago, bustling through his home with unspoken diligence, a maid who blended into the silence of rooms he never truly inhabited. Back then he had barely noticed her, but now, seeing her reduced to sleeping in an airport corner had struck a wound deep within him, a wound that no amount of wealth could easily ignore. Meanwhile, across the city in a modest shelter, Maya awoke to the faint sounds of children's laughter echoing down the hallway. Her daughter lay curled against her side, still asleep, a faint smile on her lips as if dreams had given her a rare reprieve from worry. Maya's body ached with the residue of long days and sleepless nights, but it was her heart that bore the heaviest strain. Memories of Jonathan standing before her in disbelief replayed endlessly. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times, meeting someone from her past, who had once stood so high above her, but she had never expected it to be him, the man who once seemed untouchable. She wondered if he pitied her, or worse, judged her weakness. Yet beneath her embarrassment, there was also a tiny, dangerous flicker of hope, the thought that perhaps he had seen her humanity in ways no one else had. Jonathan, restless, abandoned his office mid-morning and drove himself instead of relying on his chauffeur, an act so rare that his staff whispered about it behind closed doors. He drove not toward the stock exchange or the corporate boardroom, but toward the very shelter Maya had walked into the night before. For the first time in decades, he wasn't guided by profit, strategy, or optics. He was guided by a gnawing compulsion he could neither name nor suppress. Pulling up outside the weathered brick building, he sat in his sleek car for nearly half an hour, wrestling with an unfamiliar vulnerability. How could a man like him, who once dismissed her without thought, now walk through those doors and face her? And yet he could not turn away. Something about her condition, the tired resignation in her eyes, had stripped away his carefully crafted detachment. He needed to know more. He needed to understand. Inside, Maya felt her heart stutter when she saw him standing awkwardly in the doorway of the shelter's common room, an expensive suit at odds with the peeling paint and the faint smell of soup drifting from the kitchen. For a moment she thought she had imagined him, a ghost conjured by exhaustion. But when he spoke her name softly, Maya, she knew it was real. Conversations around them hushed. Volunteers and families glanced curiously as the billionaire CEO stood uncomfortably among them, his polished shoes planted on scuffed linoleum floors. Maya rose slowly, protective instinct pulling her daughter closer, suspicion flashing across her tired expression. Why was he here? What did he want from her? Jonathan, for perhaps the first time in his adult life, struggled for words. He wasn't here as a benefactor, nor as the powerful man accustomed to being obeyed. He was here stripped of title, of armor. I need to understand, he finally said. What happened after you left my house all those years ago? How did life bring you here? His voice broke slightly on the last word, as if the sight of her circumstances was too much for him to bear. Maya stood silent for a long moment, her pride battling against her pain. The room seemed to shrink, every gaze on her, waiting. At last, she spoke, her voice calm but edged with quiet fire. She told him of her years working endless shifts, the loss of her mother, the betrayal of someone she had trusted with her savings, the relentless weight of raising a child alone with no safety net. She spoke of nights cleaning offices where no one ever looked at her, mornings where she skipped meals to make sure her daughter ate, moments when she felt herself disappear into invisibility. And then she said the words that lodged themselves in Jonathan's chest like an iron blade. I never wanted charity. I only ever wanted dignity. But somewhere along the way, the world decided I didn't deserve even that. Jonathan felt a flood of shame he could not disguise. His fortune, his empire, his pristine reputation, none of it shielded him from the raw truth of her suffering. For the first time, he realized how deeply the gulf of privilege had blinded him to the human stories that existed just beyond the polished glass of his skyscraper. He wanted to tell her he was sorry, but the words felt too small. Instead, he asked, "What do you need now, Maya?" Not tomorrow, not someday, but today. His sincerity stunned her. No one had asked her that in years. She looked at her daughter, then back at him, and whispered, "I need a chance." Not for me, for her. And as her daughter looked up with wide, hopeful eyes, Jonathan felt something shift within him, a responsibility he had never imagined shouldering, and yet one he could no longer refuse. Jonathan Langston had always believed. The wealth was a fortress, thick walls of money, reputation, and influence that could shield him from the pain and imperfections of the world. For years, that fortress had kept him insulated from anything that could wound his pride or disturb his routine. But now, standing in the quiet of his own office late one evening, staring at the faint reflection of his own face in the tall glass window overlooking the city, Jonathan realized that fortress had turned into a prison. The echoes of his past mistakes reverberated inside its walls, and the sharpest echo of all was Maya Williams. No boardroom victory, no billion-dollar deal, no award gilded in gold could drown out the memory of her face at the airport, weary and proud, holding on to the last fragments of dignity she had left. For the first time in years, Jonathan felt that his billions could not buy him forgiveness, nor erase the sharp injustice he had allowed to grow unchecked around him. Maya, meanwhile, had taken each day as if it were a battlefield. Life had not given her softness. It had demanded resilience, demanded that she turn every ounce of hurt into resolve. Yet, in the silence of her modest apartment, when her daughter fell asleep curled up against her side, she sometimes wondered how much longer she could fight. Each job interview was another rejection. Each promise of opportunity evaporated before her eyes once. Employers saw her resume with gaps carved by circumstances beyond her control. She carried the unspoken truth like a stone in her chest. The world rarely forgave women like her, women who had once worked as maids, who had once been overlooked, who had once loved someone powerful and left with nothing to show for it but memories and scars. And yet, she refused to let her daughter inherit despair. For that little girl, Maya rose each morning with quiet strength, her voice steady even when her hands trembled. It was fate or something larger that their worlds collided again when Jonathan decided he could no longer hide behind the excuses of time. He arranged for a scholarship fund in Maya's daughter's name, discreetly at first, hoping she would accept it as anonymous charity, but Maya had never been a woman to accept faceless pity. When she found the truth, when she saw his signature inked across the papers, she stormed into his corporate tower, her voice shaking not from weakness but from anger. "Do you think money fixes everything?" she demanded, standing in the very lobby where years ago she had once walked invisible as a cleaner. "Do you think my daughter's future is something you can purchase like another property, another company?" Her words were sharp, cutting through the hushed silence of employees watching the scene unfold. For the first time in his life, Jonathan did not reply with power or dismissal. He simply stood, absorbing her pain like a man finally stripped bare of armor. The confrontation marked a turning point not just for Jonathan and Maya, but for everyone around them. The media caught wind of it, twisting the story into headlines about a billionaire's hidden past and a woman who had the courage to confront him publicly. Some painted Maya as a victim, others as an opportunist, but none of them knew the truth of her sleepless nights, the weight of raising a child alone, or the ache of being discarded by a man who once claimed to see her worth. Jonathan, shaken by the storm, retreated not into silence but into action. For the first time, he began dismantling the toxic structures inside his company, policies that excluded, cultures that demeaned, leaders who abused. It was not redemption yet, but it was the first step toward it. And Maya, though still cautious, felt the shift. She saw in Jonathan's eyes something she had never seen before: humility. He did not come to her with excuses or with roses meant to plaster over wounds. He came with quiet, consistent presence. He showed up to parent-teacher meetings not to prove himself but to stand beside her. He waited in silence outside her apartment one evening, not demanding forgiveness but offering to carry groceries upstairs. He began, piece by piece, to earn back the trust he had once shattered. It was not grand gestures that softened Maya's heart. It was the little ones, the ones that told her he was no longer the man who abandoned her at the first sign of imperfection. Yet forgiveness is not simple, nor is it quick. Maya wrestled with her pride, her dignity, and her memories. Part of her wanted to slam the door and never let him in again, to shield her daughter from the chaos of complicated adult histories. But another part, the part that remembered the boyish smile beneath the billionaire's mask, the part that remembered how he once made her laugh in the most ordinary of ways, whispered that maybe people could change, if they were willing to bleed for it. And Jonathan was bleeding now, not with the arrogance of wealth, but with the raw honesty of a man who knew he had failed and was willing to fight. To make it right, the city outside glimmered with lights, each window holding a story of its own. In one of those windows, in one of those quiet apartments, Maya tucked her daughter into bed and lingered by the doorway, wondering if perhaps life was offering her a second chance, not just at love, but at justice, at healing, at rewriting. The story she had been forced to carry alone for too long. She whispered a silent prayer into the darkness, not asking for riches or revenge, but simply for strength. Strength to decide if Jonathan Langston's return was the beginning of something real, or just another storm waiting to break her heart again. The morning sun spilled across the marble floors of Jonathan's penthouse, its light touching the glass walls and bouncing back like golden fire. But inside, the air felt heavy, weighed down by truths finally unearthed. Jonathan stood by the wide balcony looking out at the city that once bowed to him, the skyline sharp against the pale blue. He was a man who had built empires, torn down rivals, and carried himself as if power were stitched into his skin. Yet at that moment all the glass and steel seemed hollow. For on the couch behind him, Maya sat with her son, both clutching a single old photograph, the photograph that confirmed what Jonathan could no longer deny. The boy was his son. His blood? His reflection, though carried on softer lines shaped by Maya's gentleness rather than Jonathan's ruthless ambition. Maya's eyes carried storms, though her voice was calm when she finally spoke. "All these years, Jonathan, do you know what it took for me to survive while you lived like this?" She gestured to the gleaming walls, the polished furniture, the symbols of wealth that screamed of excess. "Do you know how many nights I worked myself to the bone so he could eat, so he could have shoes, so he could feel like a child instead of a burden?" Her voice trembled, but it was not weakness. It was the fire of someone who had borne pain alone and refused to break. Jonathan turned, his jaw tight. Words pressed against his throat, but none seemed strong enough to bridge the distance between them. He had rehearsed apologies 1,000 times in silence, but faced with Maya, with the truth, he could only admit, "I was blind, and worse, I chose to be blind. I thought success excused everything, even the mistakes I buried." The boy, Nathan, looked between them, confusion in his wide brown eyes. He didn't understand all the layers, the years of silence and betrayal, but he felt the tension like a storm pressing against his chest. Finally, he whispered, "Why didn't you want me?" The words sliced Jonathan open more brutally than any rival's betrayal ever had. The city outside seemed to fall silent. The man who could silence boardrooms with a single glare found himself stripped of power before a child's trembling question. Jonathan crossed the room, kneeling so his eyes met Nathan's. His hands shook as he reached out, hesitating before resting them gently on the boy's shoulders. It wasn't that I didn't want you. It was that I didn't know how to be what you deserved, and instead of learning, I ran. That is my greatest shame. His voice broke on the last word, and for the first time in decades, Jonathan Langston, the man known for being untouchable, let his tears fall without restraint. Maya watched him, her own chest tightening. She had imagined this moment countless times, imagined hating him, spitting her rage in his face. But seeing him now, stripped of the armor he once wore so arrogantly, she felt the strange pull of something deeper than anger. Not forgiveness, not yet, but recognition. Recognition that even the mighty fall, and sometimes in their collapse, they discover the humanity they abandoned. The silence stretched until Nathan, with the strange bravery only a child could summon, reached up and wiped at Jonathan's tear with his small hand. "You don't have to run anymore," he whispered. Those words hit Jonathan harder than any verdict, because in them was grace he knew he didn't deserve. Maya closed her eyes, fighting tears of her own. The room was filled not with resolution, but with the fragile beginning of something raw and uncharted. A boy's quiet mercy. A mother's guarded strength. A father's broken vow, spoken not in triumph but in humility. For the first time, Jonathan realized that empires could fall and fortunes could vanish. But this fragile moment between the three of them was the only wealth that had ever truly mattered. The airport reunion that changed everything. Jonathan Langston stood in the center of the airport lounge, his tall frame silhouetted against the wide glass windows where planes lifted into the sky. The chaos of voices, rolling luggage, and flight announcements swirled around him, but his focus was only on her. Maya Williams sat slumped against her small carry-on, her head bent as if the weight of the entire world pressed down on her shoulders. Her once lively eyes were shadowed, her lips trembling in silence, and her two children curled up beside her, innocent, unknowing, trusting Dot. For a long moment he could not move. It felt like the universe had spun a circle, bringing him back to the very thing he had once ignored, the very person he had dismissed without thought years ago. Maya, his former maid, was not standing in some mansion doorway or bowing her head in service. She was here, stripped of dignity by life's cruel hand, yet still holding her children like a shield. And in that raw picture of survival, Jonathan saw his own reflection, a man who had everything but carried an emptiness he could never name. He took a step forward, and then another, until his shadow fell across her. Maya's head lifted slowly, her tired eyes locking onto him. For a second, disbelief flickered across her face. She blinked once, twice, almost as if her mind was playing tricks on her. Then her lips parted in a whisper so fragile he could barely hear it. "Jonathan?" The sound of his name, spoken without bitterness but with aching disbelief, cut through him. He crouched down to her level, his hand reaching out but stopping short, hovering in the air. "Yes, Maya," he said, his voice low, steady, but carrying years of unspoken guilt. "It's me." Her children stirred, curious eyes peeking up at the tall stranger. Jonathan's chest tightened when he saw the small girl clutching a worn teddy bear with a button missing from its eye, and the boy leaning protectively into his mother's side. Innocence, fragile and pure, wrapped around her pain. Maya swallowed hard, her throat bobbing. "Why are you here?" she asked, her tone almost breaking. "Why now?" Jonathan inhaled deeply. For years he had carried the arrogance of a man who believed money could excuse absence, who thought apologies could be written with checks. But here, in front of her, in front of these children, he knew none of that mattered. He had to speak not as a billionaire, not as Jonathan Langston the tycoon, but as a man who once failed another human being. "Because," he said softly, his voice trembling despite himself, "I can't walk away again. Not this time, not when you need someone to stand with you." Her lips quivered. She shook her head faintly, as though his words were too heavy to accept. "Jonathan, you don't know what I've been through." "I don't," he admitted. but I want to, if you'll let me." For a long pause, the world between them was silent. Only the airport's distant announcements filled the air. Flight 207 to Boston is now boarding at Gate 3rd in. People brushed past, rushing to lives that had nothing to do with this fragile reunion. Yet for Jonathan, this was the only moment that mattered. The boy Maya's son looked up at Jonathan with innocent boldness. "Mister, are you going to help my mom?" The question pierced through Jonathan's chest. He blinked rapidly, swallowing the sting of emotion. He turned his gaze back to Maya, his voice breaking as he answered, "Yes, I am." Tears slipped down Maya's cheeks, soft at first, then faster, as if the years of struggle were finally spilling free. Jonathan reached out again, this time gently touching her trembling hand. She didn't pull away. Instead, her fingers, calloused from years of work and hardship, closed around his dot in that small act. Forgiveness didn't come fully, but a door opened. A door he would never let close again. The walk out of the airport, Jonathan rose, extending his other hand to the children. They hesitated, looking to their mother. Maya, still trembling, gave a faint nod. The little girl slipped her small fingers into his palm, the boy following after. And together, like a fragile unit stitched by fate, they walked out of the airport. Reporters spotted Jonathan, cameras flashing, questions flying about why the billionaire was holding hands with two children and a woman who looked exhausted, worn, unremarkable to the public eye. But Jonathan didn't stop to answer. For once, his silence was his answer. Let the world wonder. He led them through the sliding doors to the waiting car. The driver's eyes widened, but said nothing as Jonathan opened the door himself, ushering Maya and her children inside first. When the car began moving, the city lights streaming past, Maya finally whispered, her voice raw with disbelief, "Jonathan, why are you really doing this? You don't owe me anything." He turned, meeting her gaze with unflinching honesty. "Maya, once I owed you nothing, and I let that lie ruin everything. I can't undo the past, but I can choose what I do with. Today, and today I choose you. I choose to make it right." Her tears flowed freely now, her head lowering into her hands. The children leaned into her, wrapping their arms around her waist. Jonathan sat close, his heart heavy yet lighter than it had ever been. For the first time in years, he felt like a man not running from his mistakes, but walking toward redemption. The homecoming that night, Jonathan didn't return to his penthouse alone. For the first time, his towering glass home opened its doors to warmth that money had never been able to buy. Maya stepped inside hesitantly, her children's wide eyes scanning the glittering interior. But Jonathan didn't let the wealth of the space overwhelm the moment. Instead, he guided them to the family room, where a quiet fire already glowed. He turned to Maya. "This isn't charity," he said firmly. "This isn't pity. This is me asking if I can be part of your family's life. Not as your boss, not as a man above you, just as someone who wants to be here." Maya's eyes glistened as she studied him, the silence stretching. Finally, she whispered, "Do you mean that?" "Yes," Jonathan said without hesitation. "With everything. I am." Her children looked between them, sensing something unspoken, yet powerful. The boy smiled shyly, then climbed onto Jonathan's lap without warning. Jonathan froze for a heartbeat, then slowly wrapped his arms around the small frame, holding him close. The little girl leaned against his side, her teddy bear pressed against his chest. Maya watched, her lips trembling as the firelight reflected in her eyes. Something in her expression softened like a weary traveler finally seeing the horizon of home, a different tomorrow over the weeks that followed. Whispers filled the media. Jonathan Langston, billionaire, spotted with mysterious woman and children. Questions piled, rumors grew, but Jonathan ignored them all. His boardrooms could wait, his deals could pause for the first time. His life was not about profit margins, but about people. He enrolled Maya's children in the best schools, but more than that, he was there for the small things, helping with homework, laughing at dinner, tucking them into bed with stories he had never thought he'd tell. He learned how to braid his little girl's hair badly, how to build Lego castles with his new son. And slowly, in those small, ordinary acts, Jonathan discovered something extraordinary. Family. Maya, too, transformed. From the fragile figure he had found at the airport, she grew stronger each day. With Jonathan's support, she pursued the education she had once abandoned, standing tall not as someone rescued, but as someone reclaiming her voice. And through it all, Jonathan never treated her as lesser, only as equal. Only as someone he admired deeply. The public reveal months later, Jonathan stood at a charity gala, Maya by his side in a simple but elegant dress, her children holding her hands. Cameras flashed wildly. Journalists crowded, hungry for answers. Jonathan stepped forward, his voice strong and unshaken. "This is Maya Williams," he announced, his arm around her shoulders. "Years ago, I failed to see her worth. I failed to see her dignity. And that mistake cost us both years we can never get back. But today I stand here not as a man ashamed of the past, but as a man proud of the future. She and her children are my family now, and no title, no wealth, no power means more than that." The hall erupted in stunned silence, then applause. Maya's hand tightened in his. Tears shimmered in her eyes, but this time they were not tears of pain. They were tears of something new. Hope. The ending that was a beginning. As the applause washed over them, Jonathan turned to Maya, his voice low, meant only for her. "I can't change where we started, but I promise you I will never let you face this world alone again." Maya smiled through her tears, whispering back, "And I'll never stop reminding you that love, not money, makes a man rich." Their children clung to them, the four of them standing together beneath the golden lights of the hall. And in that moment, Jonathan Langston, once a man of steel and glass, finally understood that his greatest empire was not built in boardrooms, but in the fragile, unbreakable bonds of family. It was not the end. It was the beginning.